August 1945. The war had ended, but the world still smelled of smoke and rust. Inside a makeshift wooden canteen on the outskirts of Manila, a group of emaciated Japanese women sat in silence. They had once been army nurses, clerks, and Red Cross volunteers, loyal servants of the Emperor's divine will. Now they were prisoners. Their uniforms were torn, their skin pale from months of captivity and hunger. An American cook placed a tin plate in front of them. Steam rose from a strange, unfamiliar food, browned meat between soft white bread, glistening with fat. The women stared. The smell was intoxicating, warm, and alien. One of them whispered, "Beef?" Another muttered, trembling, "Forbidden." For years they had been taught that rice was sacred, the emperor's gift, and that Western food corrupted the spirit. But hunger spoke louder than pride. A single bite broke decades of belief. The texture, tender, salty, rich, flooded their empty senses. Some cried quietly as they chewed, overwhelmed not by taste alone, but by realization. The war was over. The empire was gone. And with every bite, the world they had known dissolved, replaced by something they could never return from. The fall of Japan in 1945 was not a single explosion, but a slow implosion of belief. For nearly 15 years, the Japanese Empire had told its people that dying for the emperor was the highest form of life. From the schoolyard to the battlefield, the word rice meant more than food. It was the body of the nation. Soldiers carried it like a relic. Women boiled it in shrines before praying to framed portraits of His Majesty. To waste even a grain was treasonous. When the surrender was announced on August 15, 1945, radio stations in Tokyo went silent. Across Asia, from Burma to the Philippines, thousands of Japanese personnel, men and women alike, found themselves suddenly stripped of purpose. Many were captured in hospitals, airfields, or small jungle outposts that had run out of supplies months earlier. Among them were female nurses of the Imperial Army and volunteer aides attached to the Japanese Red Cross. They had endured tropical diseases, air raids, and starvation, nursing dying soldiers long after their morphine ran out. In Allied records, they were described as non-combatant internees, but in practice, they were treated as prisoners of war. In the Philippines, where battles had turned cities into rubble, improvised POW camps were established in former schools and warehouses. Barbed wire enclosed what had once been gardens. Inside, several hundred women were kept under guard, uncertain whether they would face trial or release. Their condition shocked even hardened American officers. Many weighed less than 80 pounds. Beriberi had swollen their legs. Malaria left their skin gray. The daily ration was a thin porridge of rice mixed with weevils or spoiled cornmeal. When available, local farmers sold bananas or dried fish, but Allied supply chains were chaotic. After years of blockade, even the victors were short of food. Yet in the months following surrender, the U.S. military government began implementing an unprecedented policy to feed, not punish. General Douglas MacArthur's occupation authority believed that rebuilding Japan's spirit required first rebuilding its stomach. For the Americans, food was not merely aid, it was diplomacy, a message written in flavor. Canned meat, flour, and condensed milk arrived from U.S. bases across the Pacific. Field kitchens were set up in camps, and GIs, many barely older than the prisoners they served, became accidental ambassadors of taste. The hamburger, already a symbol of post-depression abundance back home, was chosen for its simplicity. Ground beef could be rationed, cooked fast, and stretched with onions and breadcrumbs. To the Americans, it was comfort. To the Japanese prisoners, it was blasphemy. Back in Japan, propaganda had painted American soldiers as monsters who devoured cows and desecrated the purity of rice culture. Meat eating was portrayed as the root of Western aggression. Women who served rice were told they were serving the emperor himself. The thought of biting into beef was unthinkable, a betrayal of centuries of Shinto and Buddhist tradition adapted into wartime moral code. Yet starvation knows no ideology. By late 1945, when Allied cooks began distributing hot meals to the captured and displaced, resistance gave way to trembling curiosity. In camp diaries later recovered by occupation authorities, one nurse wrote, "I could smell something foreign, grease, but sweet. I was ashamed to feel hunger." Another described watching her friend whisper a silent apology to the emperor before taking her first bite. Such testimonies reveal not only physical desperation but the spiritual disorientation of defeat. Eating American food was not simply nourishment, it was surrender performed in miniature. Outside the fences, the same drama unfolded across OCC. UP, Japan. Urban centers lay in ruins, rice fields had been bombed or requisitioned. Millions faced starvation during the winter of 1945-46. U.S. shipments of wheat and meat substitutes saved countless lives. Japanese newspapers, now censored but encouraged to promote cooperation, began publishing recipes for flour meals and meat cakes. The American hamburger, though rare, quickly became a symbol of plenty in a land stripped of everything. For the women in the Manila camp, the first taste came quietly. No ceremony, no speech. Just the smell of sizzling meat in a tin-roof kitchen, the hiss of grease on steel, and a soldier ladling portions with a practiced hand. They ate in silence, unsure whether to feel gratitude or shame. What they did not yet realize was that this meal would become a metaphor for the nation's transformation, from isolation to imitation, from sacred rice to secular survival. Their moment at the table would echo through post-war Japan, shaping how a defeated empire learned to live again through food. The next phase of their story unfolded not behind wire, but in the kitchens and cafeterias of a hungry country rebuilding its identity one meal at a time. When Japan's empire crumbled, the country faced a famine that threatened to finish what the bombings had not. Cities were reduced to ashes, ports destroyed, and railways jammed with refugees. Yet even amid the ruins, an invisible struggle was underway between the hunger of survival and the pride of tradition. Rice, once sacred, had become almost mythical. The emperor's voice, broadcast in surrender, had stripped his divinity but not the emotion attached to his food. People whispered that eating rice again will mean Japan is reborn, but for most, rice was now a memory. The Allied occupation led by General MacArthur moved quickly to prevent chaos. The first task was to feed millions of civilians and POWs scattered across Asia and the Pacific. For female prisoners and internees, especially in camps across the Philippines, Singapore, and Indonesia, the sudden arrival of American rations felt surreal. They had spent years believing the enemy's food was poisoned, unclean, or morally corrupt. The Imperial Ministry of Education had once issued pamphlets warning that Western diets made bodies strong but spirits weak. Rice keeps the soul pure, one wartime slogan declared, but purity did not fill empty stomachs. As U.S. food supplies began to circulate, camp kitchens became small laboratories of cultural collision. American cooks tried to interpret local tastes. They used less salt, sometimes mixing rice flour into bread dough to soften it. Yet the hamburger, greasy, fragrant, and distinctly foreign, always drew attention. Made from ground beef and reconstituted rations, it was nothing luxurious. Still, it carried something Japan had not tasted for years: abundance. Among the Japanese women POWs, many were former nurses and clerks accustomed to hierarchy and self-control. Now, stripped of uniform and authority, they faced the humiliation of accepting meals from their conquistadors. Some bowed deeply before each dish, not out of gratitude, but as a gesture of mourning for what they were losing, a culture that had told them to refuse everything Western. The smell of beef frying in oil seemed to mock that old pride. Those who took the first bites described the experience in conflicting ways. Some said the taste of meat revived memories of childhood festivals before the war, when luxury foods were still allowed. Others felt guilt, as though chewing meant betraying the fallen soldiers they had tended. I cried, one recalled years later, not because it was delicious, but because I realized I was alive. Hunger, it seemed, had dissolved the line between loyalty and survival. Meanwhile, in occupied Japan, similar changes were reshaping everyday life. American GIs shared chocolate, canned ham, and chewing gum with children who had never seen such things. School lunches, introduced under U.S. supervision, replaced traditional rice balls with bread and milk. Housewives learned to cook using wheat, shortening, and tinned meat. Newspapers began printing columns with recipes translated from American manuals. Within a few years, dishes once despised as enemy food became symbols of modernity. For women who returned home from captivity, these shifts carried heavy emotional weight. Many had been raised in families where rice rituals tied directly to imperial loyalty. A bowl of white rice before the household shrine, offered to the emperor's portrait each morning. Now, when they saw hamburgers in cafes or sandwiches in school canteens, they saw echoes of that first meal in captivity. The moment when their old faith cracked open. It was not just about taste, it was about identity itself. In the Japanese language, new words appeared to describe this change. Yoshoku, meaning Western-style food, entered common usage. Restaurants began serving hybrid dishes: hamburger steak with rice, curry adapted from British Navy recipes, and breaded pork cutlets inspired by German schnitzels. These were not acts of imitation, but of transformation. The Japanese spirit of adaptation took the enemy's food and made it its own. The transformation was not immediate nor painless. For many, especially those who had endured captivity, the memory of eating that first hamburger lingered like a scar. It reminded them of hunger, defeat, and humiliation. Yet it also symbolized survival, a quiet defiance of death itself. The same women who once whispered prayers to the emperor over bowls of rice would later feed their children bread and meat without hesitation. History had changed their menu, and through it, their faith in what Japan could be. The journey from sacred rice to American bread had begun in those prison camps, one bite at a time. And as the nation rebuilt, that act, small, human, and universal, became a bridge between conqueror and conquered, nourishment and surrender, memory and change. In captivity, hunger stripped away everything except instinct. These women had once been instruments of the imperial army, trained to obey, to endure, to serve the emperor even in death. Behind the wire, obedience no longer had meaning. They were nobody's soldiers, nobody's subjects, just bodies trying to stay alive. Their hair was cut short to keep lice away, their uniforms replaced by ill-fitting allied garments. Each day began with the same struggle: a ladle of watery porridge, a line for latrines, another hour waiting for news that never came. The day hamburgers were served, there was no speech, no permission. When they lifted the warm, soft bread, the act itself felt like rebellion. One bite, and the war that had lived inside them for years began to crumble. For generations, Japan had equated food purity with national purity. The emperor's rice was sacred because it came from Japanese soil, blessed, cultivated, and consumed under divine right. Eating imported food was once seen as an insult to that divine order. But starvation changes every rule. In the camp, hunger became the great equalizer, erasing distinctions between conqueror and conquered. The mind, once fortified by propaganda, began to question: if the enemy feeds you, is he still the enemy? When the women ate hamburgers, they were not just feeding their bodies. They were dismantling the invisible wall of ideology built inside them since childhood. A Japanese cuisine before the war was built on restraint, subtlety, minimalism, ritual. Each meal mirrored the discipline of its people: small portions, quiet manners, attention to harmony. The American meal was its opposite: loud, rich, fast, and unapologetically filling. The hamburger, greasy and aromatic, was an edible metaphor for the West itself, abundant, confident, and chaotic. When Japanese women tasted it, they confronted not only new flavors, but a new civilization. It wasn't just beef and bread, it was the taste of freedom, indulgence, and modernity, concepts that Japan's military code had spent decades suppressing. After the war, many of these women struggled with guilt. In their diaries, some wrote of shame for having enjoyed American food while their comrades died. Others described nightmares in which the emperor watched them eat. Yet as time passed, this guilt softened into reflection. They realized that survival itself was not treason. The act of eating had not been betrayal. It had been resilience. It marked the beginning of a new loyalty, not to empire, but to life itself. The Americans knew what they were doing. Food was strategy. Feeding prisoners and civilians alike was part of a larger operation to replace Japan's militarist ideology with trust, dependency, and gratitude. MacArthur's administration understood that a full stomach could make a more loyal ally than any treaty. American rations, from canned meat to flour, became the first exports of cultural dominance. Through kitchens and canteens, the United States reshaped post-war Japan far more effectively than through guns. By 1947, food democracy had become an official policy, its mission simple: teach Japan to eat like America, and it will think like America. To many Japanese, defeat had not just destroyed their nation, it had ruptured their relationship with the divine. The Emperor's surrender broadcast, the first time his voice was ever heard, had declared that the Japanese spirit must endure the unbearable. For those in the camps, that endurance took shape in unexpected ways. They endured by living, by tasting, by adapting. The hamburger, once forbidden, became a strange form of communion, the body of a new world they were forced to join. Through it, they realized that the divine could no longer be found in rice alone, but perhaps in the simple act of sharing food with a former enemy. In this way, the story of the first American hamburgers eaten by Japanese women POWs is not trivial. It is a quiet microcosm of the 20th century, where empires fell not just to bombs but to ideas that entered through the senses. The women did not know it then, but they were tasting the future, one where Japan would rebuild, not by reviving its past, but by absorbing what had once seemed unthinkable. That night, as the camp settled into silence, the cooks cleaned their pans and the women lay awake on wooden cots. Some dreamed of home, some prayed, and somewhere between hunger and healing, between shame and relief, they realized that the taste of beef had already changed them. The sacred rice of the emperor still lived in memory, but it no longer ruled their hunger. Something new had begun, quietly, invisibly, irresistibly. The Allied doctors who examined the Japanese women POWs recorded cases of acute malnutrition, beriberi, scurvy, and dysentery. Their bodies had been weakened not only by lack of food, but by the strict pre-war diet that favored rice above all. Decades of imperial isolation had glorified white rice, stripping away the nutrient-rich husk in pursuit of purity and perfection. The result was fragile health disguised as devotion. When Allied physicians prescribed balanced meals, protein, fats, and vitamins, many Japanese prisoners resisted at first, associating such foods with contamination. Yet as the days passed, the effects were undeniable. The women's energy returned, their wounds began to close faster. For the first time, nourishment came not from worship but from science. That realization became one of the quiet revolutions of the post-war era. During the occupation, the Americans understood that controlling education meant controlling the future. Schools across Japan began to integrate new curricula emphasizing nutrition, hygiene, and Western dietary science. Former POWs and repatriated nurses were recruited as instructors, teaching children how to prepare simple, calorie-dense meals from imported ingredients. These same women who had once bowed before imperial portraits were now serving as messengers of a new ideology, one built not on obedience but on practicality. They taught that eating bread did not corrupt the spirit, and that hamburgers, when made cleanly, were simply another form of sustenance. In classrooms once decorated with maps of conquests, children now learned the food pyramid. The act of teaching became a second surrender, but also a kind of redemption. American surplus food, shipped in massive quantities to prevent famine, accidentally seeded an entire industry. Wheat, lard, and canned meat flooded Japanese ports, and small local vendors began experimenting. In Osaka and Yokohama, street stalls sold minced beef patties on rice, an early fusion that blended defeat with creativity. Within years, these dishes evolved into what would later be called Hamburger, the Japanese-style hamburger steak drenched in soy-based gravy. The taste that had once marked humiliation was now transformed into profit and pride. Japan's economy, still broken, began to stand on the same foundation that had fed its conquerors: efficiency, adaptation, and mass production. Food is a language, and during the occupation, it became the first shared vocabulary between Americans and Japanese. In camps and cities alike, meals replaced propaganda as the new medium of persuasion. American GIs handing out chocolate bars became symbols of kindness, not domination. Japanese women cooking with flour and butter for the first time began associating abundance with peace, not aggression. Slowly, taste itself became an agent of cultural rehabilitation. The once forbidden hamburger turned into an unspoken truce between two civilizations. In Imperial Japan, women were seen as guardians of purity, the keepers of tradition through the kitchen. Their moral worth was measured by how faithfully they served rice and miso, not foreign food. Captivity shattered that identity. When they accepted American meals, they redefined what womanhood meant in a defeated nation. They were no longer vessels of purity, but agents of survival. The post-war image of the Japanese woman changed. She was still gentle, but now practical. Still loyal, but no longer bound to an emperor's table. The hamburger became her quiet symbol of emancipation, nourishment chosen freely, not commanded from above. Across centuries, rice had represented Japan's soul. Its cultivation shaped festivals, family rituals, and even taxation. To eat rice was to belong. When American occupation introduced bread and meat, it didn't just fill bellies, it reprogrammed meaning. Bread became the emblem of democracy, meat the taste of modernization. The women who first crossed that threshold were unknowingly the bridge between two worlds, their surrender written not in treaties but in flavor. Each bite of the hamburger erased a line between past and future, self and other, divine and human. By 1948, when occupation reforms peaked, Japan's food identity had permanently shifted. School children ate bread instead of rice 3 times a week. Department stores sold canned beef labeled Beefyu no Aji, the taste of beef. The country that once saw Western food as contamination now marketed it as sophistication. Yet for those who had lived through the hunger, the memory of that first bite remained bittersweet. They remembered not only the flavor, but the silence that followed. The weight of realization that they had crossed an invisible border from one Japan to another. In the end, the story of these women is not about humiliation, nor about conversion. It is about adaptation, the oldest survival skill of all. They entered the war believing their strength came from purity. They left it learning that strength came from change. Through them, Japan's future found its flavor. A nation rebuilt not by clinging to sacred rice, but by learning to eat what once belonged to its enemy. And in that quiet act of nourishment, history's most violent century found one of its gentlest revolutions, carried not by armies, but by women who were brave enough to taste. The day the Hamburgers WWII served had no ceremony, yet it would become one of the most quietly symbolic days in the lives of the Japanese women prisoners. It was late 1945, the rainy season was ending in Luzon, and the camp smelled of damp earth and soap powder. The women were thinner than their shadows, their hair dull from malnutrition. American sentries, sweating under their khaki shirts, tried to organize a proper meal, something beyond the gray porridge they had been serving for months. In the small kitchen behind the mess hall, a field stove hissed. A sergeant named Miller, who had worked at a diner in Ohio before the war, took charge. He had scavenged a few crates of ground beef, onions, and flour from surplus supplies. His orders were simple: make something they can stomach. The Americans didn't know much about Japanese taboos or the meaning of food rituals. They only knew these women were starving. So Miller shaped the meat into rough patties, sprinkled salt, and dropped them into a pan slick with lard. The smell drifted through the yard and heads turned. For the first time in months, the air smelled of life, not decay. When the guards called the women to eat, there was hesitation. Some stepped forward, others lingered, clutching their metal tins as if unsure whether to accept defeat on a plate. The hamburgers looked alien, too thick, too oily, too American. Bread was scarce, so the patties were served with a slice of white loaf from the camp bakery, soft and pale like nothing they had ever seen. Steam curled upward, mingling with the humid air. One woman, a nurse named Yoshiko, was the first to step up. She had once worked at a Tokyo hospital where doctors taught her that beef corrupted the blood. But her stomach had stopped listening to ideology weeks ago. She accepted the plate with both hands. When she bit into the meat, the taste hit her like a memory she had never known. It was salty, smoky, alive. She chewed slowly, then faster. Around her, others began to eat. Some cried without sound. Others stared blankly, chewing as though their bodies were deciding for them. To the Americans watching, it looked like nothing more than a group of prisoners having lunch. But for the women, it was a quiet, irreversible moment. The act of eating what they had once been taught to despise was like crossing an invisible line. In that bite, they were no longer servants of the emperor. They were simply human beings. Later that night, Yoshiko wrote in a scrap of paper she had kept hidden in her medical pouch. "The smell of meat stays on my hands. I feel shame and strength at once." That contradiction summed up what every woman in that camp felt. Hunger had forced them to live beyond obedience. The hamburger was not just food, it was an awakening, one that told them the war inside their minds was ending. The next morning, rumors spread. Some said the Americans were feeding them forbidden food on purpose to erase their loyalty. Others said it was a test to see if they had truly surrendered. But when the next meal came, another hamburger, this time with rice instead of bread, no one refused. The resistance had quietly collapsed. The smell of frying beef had replaced the sound of command. Outside the camp, similar scenes unfolded across Japan. American occupation kitchens distributed food to civilians in Tokyo, Nagasaki, and Yokohama. The hunger of the defeated was so vast that ideology became irrelevant. Housewives boiled noodles from American flour. Children fought over candy dropped by GIs. Each meal dissolved a fragment of the old world. In the Manila camp, the hamburgers continued for several weeks. Slowly, laughter returned. Cautious, restrained, but real. The women's cheeks began to fill out. Some even volunteered to help in the kitchen, learning how to grind meat and season it with salt. One of them, a former dietitian from Osaka, told the American sergeant that the smell reminded her of summer festivals long before the war, when the air was full of oil and sound. Maybe, she said softly, we were not meant to starve for gods. By the time repatriation orders arrived, the women had changed in ways no one could measure. They still wore their old beliefs like scars, but they had tasted something beyond them. When they boarded ships back to Japan, many carried with them recipes, scribbled notes about how to shape patties, how to make bread rise. They didn't realize it yet, but those simple notes would become part of Japan's rebirth. Defeat had entered their bodies through nourishment, and from that nourishment something new was beginning, fragile, uncertain, but alive. By early 1946, the repatriation ships began their slow voyages home. For the Japanese women POWs, the return was not victory. It was re-entry into a country they no longer recognized. As they approached Yokohama, the coastline looked skeletal. Blackened ruins stretched where neighborhoods once stood. The emperor's palace still stood, untouched, but his voice, once divine, had fallen silent in the wind. The women disembarked quietly, wearing borrowed American coats and carrying small cloth bags filled with the only possessions they owned. Inside, some hid small mementos, a comb, a photograph, a scrap of Allied paper, and for a few, folded recipes for the Hamburger, the food that had fed them when nothing else had. To outsiders, it was a trivial souvenir. To them, it was survival, memory, and paradox. Japan in 1946 was starving. Rations had fallen below subsistence levels. Urban citizens traded heirlooms for sweet potatoes or flour. Farmers hoarded rice. Children scoured trash heaps for leftovers from occupation troops. Into this desperation, American supply ships poured food, wheat, milk powder, lard, and canned beef. It was the largest humanitarian food operation in human history, and it arrived in a nation still struggling to accept its conqueror's mercy. Among those returning from captivity, the women who had tasted Hamburger, ours carried unspoken knowledge. They had already lived through the collapse of pride and the rebirth of appetite. While others in Japan still clung to the myth of purity, these women had seen the truth. Survival required humility. When relief kitchens opened in Tokyo and Osaka, some volunteered, remembering the field stoves in Manila. They showed others how to grind meat, mix flour, and cook with fat. At first, the smell drew suspicion, but when hunger gnawed deep enough, resistance melted. Reports from the U.S. occupation archives describe the astonishment of American officers when Japanese civilians began lining up for beefcakes served in makeshift cafeterias. Within a year, small restaurants run by widows and demobilized soldiers began selling their own version of the dish. They called it hanbagu, the Japanese word for hamburger steak. It was seasoned with soy sauce and onion, served with rice instead of bread. An adaptation born of necessity and remembrance. The very food that had symbolized defeat now represented endurance. For the former POW women, it was surreal to see their secret shame become public normalcy. They had eaten that first hamburger under the weight of humiliation. Now the same smell filled the streets of Shibuya and Ginza. Some refused to eat it again, unable to separate it from the memory of captivity. Others embraced it, teaching their children that food had no nationality. One nurse wrote in her post-war memoir, "I thought I was betraying the emperor, but in truth, I was betraying death." The occupation forces noticed this shift and leaned into it. American propaganda films depicted cheerful Japanese families baking bread and serving hamburgers in clean kitchens. Democracy, the voiceover declared, begins at the dinner table. For millions, this new diet became their first contact with modern America, less through politics than through flavor. Yet beneath the optimism lay deeper wounds. Many women who had survived as POWs were shunned after returning home. Their captivity marked them as tainted, impure. Few spoke openly about their experiences. Some destroyed their diaries. Others burned the recipes they had copied. But the cultural current they had unwillingly started could not be stopped. By the early 1950s, Japan's post-war identity, from its cinema to its cuisine, was beginning to blend Western abundance with Japanese precision. In that blending, a silent transformation occurred. The emperor's sacred rice lost its divine aura, replaced by a new national faith in adaptation and innovation. Bread, butter, and beef became symbols of progress. The American hamburger, once an emblem of surrender, evolved into an icon of recovery, eaten by the same generation that had once vowed never to touch foreign food. Foe were those women. The turning point had not been the surrender broadcast or the signing of peace treaties. It had been that moment in a humid camp kitchen when hunger forced them to face themselves. They had discovered that belief could starve, but life demanded nourishment. Their acceptance of the hamburger, that simple, ordinary meal, had been both an ending and a beginning. Years later, when Japan's cities glittered with neon and prosperity, few remembered the women who had first crossed that invisible line. Their names vanished into the footnotes of war archives. Yet every time a Japanese diner served a hanbagu to a child who had never known hunger, a faint echo of that day in Manila lived on. Proof that even the smallest human act can carry the weight of an empire's fall. They had once bowed before the emperor's rice. Now they lifted bread and meat without shame. Between those two gestures lay the story of Japan's rebirth, one that began not in palaces or peace treaties, but in a prison yard where defeated women dared to eat. In the months after Japan's surrender, the empire that had once vowed to die before dishonor now found itself living on rations stamped U.S. Army property. Food became the country's new battlefield, and its salvation. For the Japanese women who had returned from captivity, the first winter at home was cruel beyond imagination. Cities were ruins, railways broken, and families scattered. The bitter cold crept into half-burned houses, where mothers fed their children thin soup made from scraps. Hunger was no longer a wartime condition. It was a national reality. The government statistics from early 1946 painted a grim picture. Caloric intake had fallen below 1,600 calories per day, half the pre-war level. Rice production had collapsed under bombing and poor harvests. Many survived on sweet potatoes, acorns, and black market bread. Yet in that same moment of desperation, something extraordinary happened. Japan's relationship with food began to change forever. The women who had eaten their first hamburgers in captivity became unlikely teachers. In small villages and temporary relief centers, they shared what they had learned: how to mix ground meat with onions, how to use wheat flour to stretch a meal, how to fry with oil instead of boiling with water. Their knowledge, born from defeat, began quietly spreading across the ruins. American occupation forces under MacArthur's directive expanded food relief to prevent civil unrest. Massive shipments of U.S. wheat, soybeans, and powdered milk arrived at Japanese ports. Every schoolchild began receiving a lunch, often a slice of white bread and a pat of butter. For many, it was their first taste of fat in years. Teachers were instructed to explain that this food came from friends, not from enemies. The message was clear: the road to recovery began with gratitude, not vengeance. By 1947, the cultural shift was visible. Ryware. Rice, once sacred, was now rationed like any other commodity. Bread lines replaced rice queues. Newspapers published articles celebrating the nutritional value of Western foods. The government launched campaigns urging people to eat wheat for the future. For some, this felt like betrayal. For others, it was liberation from the constraints of a vanished order. Meanwhile, restaurants began reopening in Tokyo's blackened alleys. Many were run by widows or demobilized soldiers who sold fried patties, cheap, filling, and quick to prepare. They called them hanbagu, a Japanese variation on the hamburger steak. Customers lined up, drawn by the scent of sizzling meat. Few cared that it came from occupation rations. They only cared that it was warm. The same women who had once trembled before eating an American meal now stood behind counters, flipping patties with calm precision. To them, the act was neither rebellion nor submission. It was survival turned into purpose. The sound of meat frying in oil became the new music of post-war Japan, blending with the cries of street vendors and the rumble of American jeeps. In the collective psyche of a nation rebuilding from ashes, food replaced ideology. The emperor's divine rice had lost its meaning. What mattered now was nourishment, work, and hope. Each meal eaten in peace felt like a small victory, a quiet defiance of the hunger that had nearly erased them. For the women who had once been prisoners, this transformation carried deep personal meaning. They had witnessed how quickly belief could crumble when faced with starvation, and how easily compassion could return through the simple act of feeding another human being. The same hands that once saluted the emperor's portrait now kneaded dough, mixed batter, and served strangers with quiet dignity. Defeat had turned them into bridge builders, between empires, between ideologies, between starvation and survival. And as the smell of hamburgers began to mingle with the scent of soy and rice across post-war Japan, these women knew, even if history would forget them, that they had tasted the beginning of a new world. By 1948, Japan's transformation through food had become unstoppable. The occupation reforms had reshaped not only the government and education, but also the national palate. The women who had once eaten hamburgers in captivity now watched their homeland adopt Western-style meals on a scale no one could have imagined during the war. Cafeterias, schools, and even factories began serving bread and meat as standard fare. The words pan, bread, and Hamburger became part of daily conversation, symbols of a country leaving its past behind. In Tokyo's crowded districts, the smell of frying oil drifted through alleys rebuilt from the rubble. Street vendors sold meat patties with rice, calling them victory meals without irony. Housewives, once guardians of imperial purity, now bought American flour from occupation depots and proudly baked for their families. The kitchen, once a shrine to tradition, became the birthplace of adaptation. For many women, cooking with foreign ingredients was both necessity and redemption. They could not rebuild the empire, but they could feed their children. The memory of the first hamburger never faded from those who had lived it. For them, it remained a private threshold, the moment when defeat became survival. Some later wrote about it in memoirs published quietly in the 1950s. Others never spoke of it at all. In those writings, the tone was neither patriotic nor ashamed, but reflective. One former POW wrote, "The hamburger was not delicious, not at first. It was strange, heavy, but it taught me that even in defeat, one can eat and still be human." That notion, humanity through nourishment, resonated deeply with post-war Japan. Across the ruins, compassion began to replace dogma. Soldiers returned home to find their wives feeding children with American milk and bread, and though many felt unease, none could deny the strength it brought. The war had starved a nation not only of food but of empathy. The occupation's meals, unintended as they were, became a form of quiet healing. American sociologists stationed in Tokyo noticed the pattern. Reports to Washington noted that the Japanese population associates food aid with moral recovery. The hamburger, in particular, appeared in countless diaries and newspapers as a symbol of the New World. It was no longer enemy food. It had become nourishment without nationality. In post-war advertisements, restaurants proudly displayed signs reading "American taste, Japanese heart." For women, this change was profound. They had been told their role was to sacrifice, to serve silently, to preserve purity. Now, feeding their families meant embracing imperfection, even foreignness. The act of eating American food, once seen as moral corruption, now represented care and continuity. Every meal became a declaration that life was stronger than ideology. By the early 1950s, the Hamburger was no longer a novelty. It was a staple. School lunches across the nation served it weekly. Newspapers published recipes alongside essays about nutrition and modern living. The same generation that had once bowed before the emperor's portrait now read American cookbooks translated into Japanese. The hamburger had completed its journey, from an object of shame to a national comfort food. For the former POW women, it was surreal to witness the transformation of what had once been a symbol of their surrender into the flavor of Japan's rebirth. They rarely received recognition, but in every bite taken by a new generation, their story lived on, quietly, invisibly, like a secret ingredient in the nation's recovery. The empire had fallen not only through bombs and treaties, but through hunger, humility, and adaptation. And somewhere in that long journey, from the sacred rice of the emperor to the humble hamburger, Japan found a new kind of strength, a strength born not from conquest, but from the courage to change. Sacred rice that had symbolized purity and loyalty could no longer sustain a nation built on myth. The hamburger, simple, foreign, once despised, became a strange messenger of equality. It asked for no prayer, no ritual, no emperor. It only offered nourishment. In that offering, it carried a truth the war had tried to erase, that humanity is stronger than ideology and hunger knows no nationality. For the women who lived through it, that realization never faded. Their story was never written in grand speeches or carved on monuments, but in memory, in the smell of frying meat, in the first warmth of fullness after years of hunger, in the quiet knowledge that the world had changed inside them. They did not betray their country by eating. They reclaimed their right to live, and through them, Japan found its way forward. The nation that once worshipped purity learned to thrive through mixture, blending Western abundance with Eastern grace, transforming defeat into creativity. Every hamburger steak served in a Tokyo diner today carries that unseen lineage, the moment when belief yielded to survival, and survival gave birth to renewal. In the end, the women who ate the emperor's forbidden food taught Japan its greatest post-war lesson, that strength is not in denial, but in acceptance, not in the sacredness of rice, but in the courage to taste the unfamiliar. Through them, an empire ended, and a new humanity began.